Hello everyone and welcome. In this video we're going to talk about loops. I'll give you a broad understanding of what loops are and why we use them, and then I'll take you through a specific use case and a specific type of loop, the for loop. And by the end of this video I think you'll be ready to implement for loops in your programs, and in no time you'll be writing them second nature. All right, let's get started. Okay, so here I am. I have an empty JavaScript file and I have an HTML file with that JavaScript file linked in simply so I can run the JavaScript in the browser. So, what is a loop? A loop is a block of code that can execute multiple times in succession, potentially many times. That's a great tool because there are many times in programming where we need to do a task many times sequentially. And if we didn't have loops, we would have to write out the code that many times by copying and pasting, and it would just be terribly annoying. Fortunately, loops have been around for a long time, and it's no wonder that they are used constantly throughout programming. So, one particularly common use case for a loop is iterating through an array. Iterating means to visit each index of that iteratable object, an array being an example of an iteratable object. So if I want to iterate through an array, let's first make an array. Var my array, and I am being distracted by the cat right now, but I'm going to just keep soldiering on. We're going to give it a couple strings here. We'll say first, second, third, and fourth. Not a very long array, but let's use a for loop to iterate through each one of these and console log each index of the array as we do so. So that's where the for loop comes in handy. For loop declaration looks like this. The keyword for, followed by a pair of parentheses, which we will fill in momentarily, followed by a set of curly brackets, which is where our code block goes. That's the code block that will be executed multiple times over, and in this case, 4 times the length of our array. But a for loop, without declaring some specific behavior in our declaration, doesn't know how many times to do it, when to stop. We need to be very specific about that. And so there are 3 components that go in our for loop declaration. First one is called initialization. Second one is called condition. And the third one is called update. And notice I've separated each of those components with a semicolon because that is the syntax for separating them here in our for loop declaration. So initialization. What we do in a for loop is we declare a variable and we use it as a means of keeping track of where our for loop is. In this case, we want to use that variable to keep track of which index of the array we are currently at. And since we want to start at index 0, we're going to initialize it at 0. So I'm going to say var I equals 0. I could have called this anything like any other variable, but it's very conventional, especially when you're iterating through something, to use I as the variable name. You'll see this all throughout other people's code. Plus, it's nice. I stands for index and it's 1 letter long. I'd say go with I. So now we've initialized our variable to keep track of which index we're on. We're going to specify a condition during which this for loop will run. We know that we don't want our for loop to run more than 4 times. And the way we tell it to stop at the end of this 4-element array is to say, do this while I is less than the array's length. So the array's length is 4. So it will only do this as long as I is less than 4. So if I is 3, that's great. We'll be at index 3, which is here, the last one. But as soon as it becomes 4, it will no longer execute the code block. And it will, in fact, exit the for loop entirely and carry on with any other code you might have after the for loop. But as it stands now, I is being set to 0, and it's not changing. So therefore, this condition would evaluate to true every single time, and we would have an infinite loop, which is never good. We need our for loop to stop at some point. We need this expression to evaluate to false. So we're going to provide an update to the variable so that it eventually will. And the most common one you'll see is the plus plus. Plus plus increments the value by 1. So each time the code block is executed, I will be incremented by 1. So it'll start at 0, run the code block, increment I by 1, and now I will be equal to 1. It will check the condition again, still less than 4, so it will run the code block again, and so on and so forth until finally I reaches 4. This expression no longer evaluates to true, and the for loop is completed. This is a very standard for loop declaration. You will eventually know how to write this in your sleep. Var I equals 0, I is less than the array.length, I plus plus. It's almost like a chant. The only thing that changes is the name of the array, but this is the way that you would iterate from beginning to end of an array. And so we'll make a little code inside the code block. A simple console log will do, just to show us each index of the array. And to represent each index of the array, we pass the variable I as the index. And we know that that will increment by 1 each time, starting from 0 until it has reached the end of the array. Perfect. Let's have a look at that in the browser. Open the console. Boom. We iterated through the entire array with just one line of code in the code block. Great. That is probably the most common use case for a for loop, not just console logging, but performing any kind of operation that we want to perform on each index of an array. But let's say we're searching for something in the array, and when we find it, we no longer need to keep iterating through the array. Let's say there's a magic word right here, like the word magic. And so we are looking for this specific word, and when we find it, we'll console log found it, and we will not continue iterating through the array. The way we would do that is we would first check if if the current index that we're at, my array at index I, is equal to magic, then we will console log found it, and then we will break. Break is a keyword in JavaScript, and it is used to execute a loop. It'll exit you out of any loop that you are in. As soon as it runs into the break, the for loop will be done. So let's look at that in the console. I'll reload it. And sure enough, it console logged first, second, and magic, and then it said it found it, and it didn't bother console logging third or fourth. I realize it's a little confusing because there's now 5 elements in there, but you see what happened. We met this condition here when we reached magic, and we broke out of the for loop. That's pretty cool. Sometimes you don't need to iterate through the entire array. Or there might be times where you don't need to start at index 0. You could change this to, index 2, and then it would simply reach magic the first time around and exit out of it immediately. It would only run the for loop one time in that case. That's cool. But here's another nifty little thing that for loops can do. You can actually have a for loop within a for loop. This is called a nested for loop. So let's say that when we get to the word magic, we want to console log each letter of the word magic individually. It turns out strings are iterable just like arrays are. And you can even use indexes on them, and you can use the dot length method on them. So let's do that. Let's create another for loop. But we're going to use a different variable name because we can't use I again. It is representing the index that we're at, and we need it to be reserved for that. So we will use J to represent the current string of the word that, I'm sorry, the current character of the string that we are at. So we'll do it just like we did to iterate through the array. We'll say var j equals 0 as long as j is less than the current word dot length. And then we'll increment j. And then we have our curly brackets for this code block. Now I want to console log each letter, and here's how you would do that. Console log the current word at a specific index. J represents the index of the letter. It represents the index of the string. I represents the index of the array. So what will happen now is we will be iterating through the array, but then when we reach magic and meet this condition, we will start iterating through the word magic. So my array at index I at this point represents the word magic, and we can reference a particular letter with index j. And it will still break after this and not console log third and fourth. Let's have a look at that. Cool. A for loop within a for loop. So I hope I didn't overwhelm you with the nested for loop. The key takeaway here is that the common use case for loop is to iterate over something, oftentimes from beginning to end. And this is the syntax of how you declare that, and then you simply put your code block in there representing what you want to execute for each iteration of the for loop. All right, guys, happy coding and happy iterating and happy for looping. Take care.